Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of March of 2025. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And probably the most interesting updates are coming from the capital Ukraine, from Kyiv. According to information we have, Zelensky may have changed his mind. Preparations for the presidential elections in Ukraine are in full swing, says the Economist source in the Ukrainian government. Zelensky reportedly instructed his team last week to prepare for the elections after the ceasefire. The first confirmation of this could come on May 5th, ahead of the Council's vote on martial law, which is taking place on the May 8th. Its cancellation would open the way to the elections. According to sources, the vote is planned for early July. Zelensky is planning to start voting president elections as early as possible because this is the only way. How can he stop his main opponents? For example, according to information we have, the former commander of Ukraine Army Zaluzhny is one of the main opponents for Zelensky, and the former president of Ukraine Petro Poroshenko. So by these actions, Zelensky first of all want to cut them from the president elections. Another important thing, the question is why Zelensky decided to start spreading this information exactly today. The thing is that several days ago, Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, when he was asking the question regarding the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, proposed to create something like a temporary administration under the United Nations organization control. So that was very interesting statement, and today the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation gave us some details regarding this plan. Russian Foreign Minister explains United Nations mechanism for temporary administrations following Putin's proposal on Ukraine. The Russian Foreign Ministry has outlined the process by which the United Nations establishes temporary administrations in the conflict zones. The first and essential condition has always been an agreement between the conflicting parties, either directly or through mediators. So first of all, Zelensky needs to accept this proposal, and of course Putin should accept this proposal as well. But we don't think that Putin has problems with this. We believe that Zelensky has a lot of problems with this, because basically he will lose control over the situation. The next step involves a formal request to the United Nations, which can be made by one of the parties, intermediaries, or the UN Secretary General. The United Nations Security Council then issues a directive to the Secretary General to develop the framework for temporary administration. This directive must be supported by the Security Council members, particularly the permanent ones. Then any member can submit a draft document for consideration. The Secretary General then prepares a report detailing the structure, budget, and operational parameters of the temporary administration. Then the members of the Security Council reviews the report's recommendations and makes a final decision on establishing the administration, requiring the approval of all members, including the permanent ones. So this is very interesting, because we see that we are coming to the next step of the negotiation process, where the Russians have just one demand, that Ukraine should be represented by somebody who is legitimate, and the Russians don't have any questions and any issues regarding this legitimacy. And according to information we have, Zelensky is not a legal president according to the Russians. So that is why the Russians will try to force Ukraine to carry out elections, and there are two options that will be accepted by the Russians. First one is the temporary administration by the United Nations organization, or you can carry out elections by yourself, and basically this is much more better for Zelensky, because once again, if he make elections, if he controls elections, basically he controls the process, which obviously increases his chances to be reelected once again. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation on the ground. Today, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation made very interesting statement regarding the situation on the ground, and today the Russians reported that as a result of a missile strike against the temporary deployment area of units of the Security Service of Ukraine and Special Operations Forces in the main Directorate of Intelligence of Ukraine, up to 170 Ukrainian servicemen and foreign mercenaries were destroyed or neutralized. surprised. Later we got details that this attack took place in the vicinity of the city by the name of Slavyansk. At least today we have a picture from this area. Fire at the sites of the strike that took place somewhere at 5 a.m. to Iskander M is landed in the vicinity of the city of Slavyansk. This is very important because I'll remind you that exactly from this area yesterday we got the first proofs that the Ukrainians are planning to use a special tactical sign for a recently created group of forces, which main purpose would be to counterattack in the vicinity of Konstantinovka, with the purpose, as we discussed during the previous videos, to cut several salients in this area: the salient of the city of Chasiv Yar, the salient of the city of Toretsk, with the purpose to improve positions before possible Russian offensive operation, and the salient in the vicinity of Vozdvizhenka. So as we can see, the Ukrainians are about to finish the regrouping and concentration of their forces in this territory, and most likely one of such groups was discovered by the Russians in the vicinity of Slavyansk and attacked by the missiles of Iskander type. The Ukrainians suffered significant losses. So we see that Ukraine preparations are underway, and very soon we're going to see much more powerful attacks from the Ukrainian side with the purpose to complete tasks they have. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. As for the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything from the city of Chasiv Yar. The Russian sources published several videos how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians almost in the same areas they bombed yesterday and the day before yesterday and a week ago, which means that the front line is moving, but is moving very, very slowly. Sometimes the front line doesn't move at all. So which means also that the Russians are not planning to intensify their activities in the very near future because they expect Ukrainian counteroffensive operation. When talking about the southern part, here we can see a bit bigger intensification of actions from the Russian side. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of Zabalka micro-district. There are still several blocks and several micro-districts that are under complete Ukraine control. So the Russians are trying to cut these pockets, pockets of resistance before the beginning of Ukraine counteroffensive operation, which most likely is going to start somewhere in a week or maybe even earlier. The Ukrainians don't have much time. They have just several weeks to finish this operation, and the most important, they need to carry out as effective, as much as successful operation as possible before possible talks regarding the complete ceasefire between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians need to have a very strong positions if they want to force the Russians to, let's say, establish ceasefire on the not just on the energy facilities but along the entire line of combat contact. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive in the southern part of Kliban-Bytsky water reservoir pocket. According to information we have, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians managed to establish almost complete control over the settlement of Alexandropol. At least according to pro-Ukrainians, the Russians established control over the fields to the east of the village, and the Russians established control over the eastern part of the village itself. The rest of the village, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, is in the gray zone. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the villages of Valentinovka and Sukha Balka. And we believe that during the next night, between the 30th and the 31st of March, the Russians will make first attempts to attack in the direction of this settlement as well. So we see that the Russian offensive in this area is gaining momentum, and we believe that the Russians have enough of forces to continue offensive operation until the Russians are able to get the village of Romanovka, basically to establish complete control over the road N20. When talking about the Russian offensives, today we got another very interesting article, and this article came to us from the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation between the villages of Kupyansk and the settlement of Orekhov. I'll remind you that since the beginning of March, the Russians are very active in this area, and almost every single day or 2 days we make another changes on map according to different reports, according to geolocations, and according to different things we see that the Russians have very good dynamic in this area, and the most important, the Russians continue their offensive. And today pro-Ukrainian sources published very interesting article. Russian troops have concentrated a large group with tens of thousands of people and hundreds of units of military equipment in the Orekhov and Zaporizhzhia directions. Russian armed forces units have achieved certain successes at the tactical level. We are talking about the Russian offensives that took place in the first and the second half of March. The main attack direction are the line of the settlements of Dolinka, Sherbaki, and Petikhatki Stepovoye. Here the Russian army managed to wedge into the Ukrainian defense to a depth of 2 kilometers. So the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians will continue their offensive operation, and the Ukrainians are saying that most likely when the Ukrainians begin their counterattack in Toretsk, Chasiv Yar directions, the Russians will continue offensive operation with the purpose to take under control the city of Orekhov. If the Russians are able to establish control over the city of Orekhov and to force the Ukrainians to fall back, this can lead to complete probably a fall of Ukrainian lines in this area. Basically, Ukrainian defense will collapse. Now let's move further and let's return back to the south Donetsk direction. And during the previous 24 hours, so the main updates we got exactly from this territory. First of all, it is very important to note that the Russians established complete FPV drone control over the road between the settlements of Vesele and the settlement of Peribulda, and further in the direction of the settlement by the name of Mirna, Pidubna, and so on. The Russians established complete FPV drone control, and during the previous 24 hours we have lots of videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory, and we believe that in the very near future the Russians will intensify their activities with the purpose to take under control all these villages and to get the south outskirts of the settlement by the name of Kamar. So this is approximately the goal and the target of the Russians for the next several days. Furthermore, we start receiving updates that the Russians increase their activities between the village of Razdolne and the village of Odradne. There are still lots of things to do for the Russians, and currently the distance between, for example, geolocated positions and the village itself is around 7 kilometers. When talking about Russian possible positions in the village itself, the distance in this case is less than 4 kilometers. Anyway, there are still lots of things to do, and the Russians these days began advancing in this direction with the purpose to outflank and to get as close as possible to the main supply road N15 that goes between the settlement of Bogatyr and between the settlement of Kamar and further the mainland of Ukraine. So this is approximately the goal for the Russians for the next several weeks, to get as close as possible, even to enter the village of Odradne itself. Furthermore, according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the village of Rozliv. Basically, the Ukrainian defense in the settlement of Rozliv collapsed completely. First, the Russians entered this territory, and this information was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources. Today, according to different neutral mappers and according to pro-Russian resources, the village is already under 60% of the village is already under complete Russian control. During the previous 24 hours, we got just one video from this territory, how the Russians were bombing and attacking the defense positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. So here we can see something like artillery preparation. So if the information about Russian progress in the area is correct, is true, then most likely in the very near future this territory will be taken by the Russians, and this is going to be another part of Russian advance, another part of big disaster that is going to happen on the Bogatyr direction. With the village of Rozliv, we believe that the village of Katerinov, Constantinople, will fall automatically, because from this configuration the Ukrainians will lose chances to hold their positions in this area. At the same time, during the previous 48 hours, we received lots of updates from the northern part of this, let's say, direction. The Russians yesterday carried out a very powerful and very successful offensive operation that allowed the Russians to break through the defense of armed forces of Ukraine and to shorten the distance to the Dnipro region for just 3 kilometers. Yesterday, the video was published by the Ukrainian side, and in this video we can see a very powerful offensive operation from the Russian side. The Russians used lots of tanks, infantry, fighting vehicles, and many other different equipment. The Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt. The Ukrainians were trying to slow down the Russians and to stop them with artillery, with FPV drones, but nothing helped them to stop the Russians, and the Russians managed to take under control the significant number of territories. Based on this video and based on the videos we got yesterday, we made lots of changes and lots of corrections exactly in the Novopavlivka direction. According to all geolocations, we see that the Russians managed to answer the settlement by the name of Preobrazhenka. There are very heavy clashes, and maybe the village is already under complete Russian control. Furthermore, according to the geolocations, the Russians managed to answer the village of Bogdanovka, very important village, one of the villages on the way to the Dnipro river, to the Dnipro region, and the Russians managed to cut the Ukrainians from the northern flank, from the settlement of Kotlarovka, from the main forces. So we see that the Russians managed to basically destroy Ukrainian defense in this direction, and it seems that during the next several days, or maybe several weeks, up to 2 weeks, not more, the Russians will be able to establish complete control over these fields and these territories, which will allow the Russians at the end to encircle the Ukrainians in Alexeyevka and Bogatyr and to cut these units in Koldrun, because from this configuration, of course, the Russians will continue tightening the news around Ukrainian positions in the Bogatyr direction. So this is a short-term plan for the Russians, probably till the end of April. So this is something that the Russians will try to achieve during the next 30 days, during the next period of negotiations, of talks between the Russians, the Americans, and the Ukrainians. Now let's move further. As for the Pokrovsk direction, it seems that the Russians managed to break the situation in their favor, and currently the Russians control the initiative. The Ukrainians stopped their counterattacks in the area of Kotlin, Pischana, Shevchenka. Maybe the Ukrainians are regrouping, maybe they basically can't do anything. The Russians today, according to information we have, according to different sources and according to geolocations, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Uspenovka. This information was confirmed by different mappers and by geolocations. Furthermore, several pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense and to answer the settlement of Novoalexandriivka from the east. This information was confirmed by pro-Russian resources, as for now without any geolocations. The first report about this breakthrough we got several days ago on the 27th of March. Another pro-Russian resource reported about this attack, and just today, basically 4 days later, another pro-Russian resource confirmed this offensive operation. So summarizing everything, currently by the end of the 30th of March, in this direction the situation may looks like something like this. So as you can see, the Russians are advancing, and the Russians are trying to reach the Dnipro, the border between Donetsk and Dnipro region, from this direction as well. This will allow the Russians first of all to reinforce their positions, to make their positions stronger in face of the threat of counterattack from the city of Pokrovsk. So we see that Ukrainians since the beginning of the Russian major offensive that started after the fall of Avdiivka haven't managed to stabilize the situation in this direction, and we see that the Russians continue advancing. Sometimes we can see some pauses in this area, but mainly these pauses are connected with another Russian regrouping, with improving of the Russian logistic and so on. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupyansk direction, where the Russians also managed to improve their position significantly. During the previous video, we have already discussed that the Russians managed to take on the Tsikotsk, Koldrus and Pitsers, the settlement of Kamenka, by additional progress on the flanks. The Russians improved their positions around the village of Kamenka from the west. This information was provided us by different neutral sources and neutral mappers, and also the Russians, according to information we have, managed to improve their positions around the settlement from the east. So the Russians are trying to get as close as possible to the last supply lines that the village of Kamenka still has. We're talking about the road through the fields, through the forest between Kamenka and Dvorichinska. If the closer the Russians are getting there, the less chances the Ukrainians on the territory of Kamenka have for successful defense. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to answer the settlement of Kindrashevka. This information was confirmed by geolocations provided by the Ukrainian side. In this video, we can see how the Ukrainians were, after withdrawing and attacking the soldiers of the armed force of the Russian Federation on the northern outskirts of the settlement of Kindrashevka. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map and we have colored these territories in Russian favor. So we start receiving first proofs that the Russians are already on the territory of this village, and we see that the Russians continue their outflanking maneuver with the purpose to cut the main supply lines and to semi-encircle the city of Kupyansk from the north and from the northwest. So the situation here is becoming very difficult for the armed forces of Ukraine. As for the northern directions, today were very heavy clashes, but without almost any changes on the ground. We have several videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine, but no changes. The Russians, of course, there are attacks. There are lots of attacks during the first 24 hours took place there, but no changes. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.